It's the final week of the month. You know what that means. It's style study time. And today's video is very special because this is an artist who has requested, but she has also been a personal style icon for me as an artist for years now. Today we're going to take a look at the stunning, dynamic, dark fantasy art of Pauline Voß, better known by her online name Skadivore. Skadivore? I hope I said that right. Today's video has been requested by our Discord member and lightworker patron, Invisible Lobster. So thank you so much for your request, and I really hope you enjoyed this video and that it's everything you've been looking for. If you're a style study veteran, thank you so much for coming back. I love you, and you can go ahead and skip to part 1, timestamps are in the description below. But if you're new here and this is your very first style study, hi, welcome. My name is Srish, and I'm so glad you're here because today we're going to level up your art by like 1,000,000%. Style Study is a regular series we do here on my channel where we take a look at some of our favorite contemporary artists, analyze their work, and see what we can learn from it. Keyword: learn. We're not here to plagiarize anyone's work or copy their style. We're simply here to learn some really cool art tips and tricks and see how we can apply them to finding our own unique art style. I usually structure my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll take a look at Paulina's work, analyze her style, and see what we can learn from it. Part 2 will be a study of one of her original paintings. The incredible reference I've chosen today is this one. And in part 3, we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. Of course, if you enjoyed this video and learned something today, please do remember to give it a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button down below. Come say hello on Instagram, Discord, and Kara. All the links are in the description below. Comment below your biggest takeaway from this study, and that's about everything. So if you're ready, grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into another style study featuring Pauline Voß. Pauline Voß is a fantasy illustrator and viz dev artist from Germany, and she is legitimately one of my new favorite people on the internet. She paints these ethereal, dark fantasy character pieces that truly transport you to a whole other world. And fun fact, I didn't realize until earlier this week that she only paints on Procreate. In an interview with Playgrounds, Paulina mentioned how she has always been fascinated by magic and fantasy and all things witchy ever since she was little. And obviously you can see exactly how that fascination colors her art now as a grown-up. Paulina's amazing work has garnered her over 54.5 thousand followers on Instagram and over 15.1 thousand followers on Twitter. In the same interview with Playgrounds, Paulina mentioned how a big part of what inspires her work is actually the dark German fairy tales that she grew up with. In her own words, the imagery was quite brutal, and that seems to have influenced her to be attracted to the more esoteric, mysterious aspects of magic and fantasy. She also talked about how she likes to think that the process of creating art is her practicing magic simply by pouring a part of her soul into the paintings, which is honestly such a powerful way to look at the creation process as a whole. Actually, you know what? I'll just link the interview down below. Go watch it after this. Personally though, the part of that interview that hit me hardest was her talking about how she doesn't deal with imposter syndrome because she knows she's really worked hard to be where she is in her art journey, and she's able to look at her work without the cloudy lens of self-doubt. How incredibly powerful is that? Not just as an artist, but as a person in general, Paulina is definitely an inspirational list. Speaking of this, here are 4 key characteristics to Paulina's art. A quick glance through Paulina's art gallery will clearly tell you that pretty much all of her art is centered around dark fantasy, witchy, magical stories. You'll see pieces like this dramatic character almost summoning these stags out of fire and moonlight, which is not something you and I would call a regular occurrence. But even with the simpler close-up shots like this one, there is a lot of supernatural themes stuck into this one piece with the 3 eyes and the green skin. But the magic isn't just in the literal elements in her compositions, because I feel like what Paulina has really mastered is a sense of mood. This Tune Me challenge she did ages ago is actually my favorite example of this phenomenon, because it is literally just based on a pretty simple self-portrait. There's no crazy magical elements, no super intricate background, but do you see how even if there weren't those floating embers or anything, this would still have been a super dark, dynamic portrait purely due to the lighting and colors and such? We'll look at both the colors and the lighting in a little bit, but I wanted to start by talking about how the combination of the two can dramatically alter any story. Here's another portrait where this character is holding very still, just listening to some music, but when you add some deep ambience and a glowing rim light to her hair, suddenly it's so much more dramatic than simply some hot tunes. Here's an example that's a little more subtle, but I think it exemplifies the point even more. This is just a very realistic portrait, and this is likely a situation you've been in before, just stood by the window in a cool light. But do you see how something as simple as blurring most of the background but preserving the slightest bit of texture not only enhances her as the protagonist, but also adds a lot of depth and this fairy tale-like feel to the whole piece? Speaking of the protagonist though, one of the most unique parts of her composition and storytelling is that Paulina always paints her characters to have all the power in the scene. Because when you look at any composition, you'll see that it is the character that is actively creating the scene around them, not the other way around. Like here with this character who's casting a spell and she summoned ribbons of light and bats and wind, and you can tell that she's the one who's caused all of this. Or here where it's slightly more realistic, but the character is the one who's caused all that money to appear and the ambience to feel all smoky and shady. A great contrast to this is actually the work of Peter Polak, whom we've done a video on before, but he paints these super dark fantasy characters as well. But do you see how in his compositions, the characters are often reacting to their environment? And then look at this piece by Paulina, do you see how different it is? It's like here, the character is in charge of the scene, as opposed to looking almost like a consequence of it. It's like all these elements in the painting are built around the character, as opposed to the character being inserted into the scene. I just thought that was a neat little storytelling detail. The overall color scheme in Paulina's work is pretty much always cool toned. There's pretty much always a blue, purple, or pink main color, perhaps with cool versions of their complementary hues as accents. Here with this close-up, there's a majority of blue and purple tones, like in the midtones and shadows of her skin, but you'll also see glowing blues and purples in her eyes, and definitely cool-toned highlights in her skin and on her lips. That said, however, if you then look at the key light, it is a warm, saturated, orangey accent. But because it is a small area and because the colors are muted, it doesn't really take away the coolness of the piece, but rather it's pretty much only there to bring balance to the color palette. Here's a painting that is made of a tetradic palette, but only one of the 4 colors involved here is truly warm. So as you can tell, we have a red-green complement, and those are both very cool toned. We also have a nice cool toned purple, but it is the complementary yellow here that is truly warm. And as you can tell, it is restricted pretty much solely to the butterflies and the glasses, and maybe the parts where it casts a glow. But again, it is there to balance the palette out rather than to take away from it. You might occasionally see an overall warm-toned painting like this one here, where the vast majority of the colors are orange, red, and brown, and here these are balanced out by little pops of blues and purples. Coming back to the cooler tone paintings, the warm accents aren't always dramatic light or magical elements. Most of the time they're simply created by warm golden jewelry. Here, for instance, where everything is cool and blue, the little pops of gold in the finger rings add a lot of contrast to the color palette, despite literally being just the tiniest little dots of color. This overall cool tone with the tiniest warm pops of color really give Paulina's art a midnight dusky feel, and I feel like that really enhances the whole mystical dark fantasy vibe of it all. It is, after all, known as the witching hour. The lighting in Paulina's work always seems super magical, and that's because it is pretty much always really dramatic, but not necessarily super shadowy. I mean, of course you have portraits like this one where the vast majority is in a deep, dark shadow, and on a scale of white to black, the brightest tone lies around a 50% value at best. So here it is obvious to see where the drama comes from, because it is due to the deep, heavy shadows. But how about a painting like this one? It is clearly made of fairly light tones, and the darkest shadows are actually rather small and lie only at the bottom of the scene, except for in her outfit, which is actually coloured black, but that's different. The vast majority of the painting lies firmly within the mid-tone to dark mid-tone value. Same here, except for the characters with the dark hair, the shadows are actually fairly bright. In fact, with paintings where you do have very dark shadows, you'll often see that the brightest key highlight is most often a mid-tone. I'm not talking about floating specks and magical elements, but rather the shadow versus highlight on the character's skin and body and such. The point is, Paulina often paints the lighting itself to be pretty low contrast, regardless of if the overall piece is dark or light. But just as an experiment, think about what time of day everything seems to be super low contrast in your surroundings. It's never when there is super bright daylight, because the brighter the light source, the higher the value contrast. However, as the sun starts to set, as night starts to fall, everything goes lower contrast because everything is starting to feel shadowy. The brightest, loudest colors around us turn to muted midtones, and the difference between light and dark seems to diminish until everything is in shadow. Do you see where I'm going with this? Even if a painting isn't super dark with lots of heavy shadow, it is actually the low contrast lighting Paulina uses that creates the effect of dusk or nighttime. It's not about the literal values, but the relative values. Mind blown. Finally, let's talk about the magical elements in Paulina's compositions. First, of course, there is the unnatural light sources. These could range from the characters themselves, to their outfits, to their magical floating orbs, or just literal balls of energy. So here, for instance, the character's headdress / cloak acts as a bright neon pink source of light, casting a glow all over their skin. Whereas here, the character has literally summoned a tiger made out of blue light. That is pretty much the primary light source in the scene. And then there's this character whose entire hair is a light source. Flower gleam and glow, am I right? Then you have the more holographic details that just feel ethereal as a concept, even in real life. These may be proper holographic objects, such as the headdress here, where you see all these rainbow colors reflected in the fabric, but the holographic colors also sometimes show up in the smaller, more subtle aspects. Here, for instance, you see the iridescent highlights in this character's hair that really elevate what is otherwise a pretty basic hairstyle, whereas here you have these holographic shards of glass taking over the entire comp. You'll also see that Paulina paints these floating embers and specks of light, and they almost always have like a holographic aura around them. I literally don't know how to make this happen, but it is so beautiful. However, my favorite magical part in Paulina's art is how she takes regular elements of nature and recontextualizes them to make them magical. Coming back to this painting, look at the size of the moon. It is massive. But also, do you see how that fire is almost being manipulated and moved by the witch lady? Then there's this scene where the character is literally summoning lightning and storm clouds and is able to control all that energy and hold it where she wants it. Here's a character literally sat on some clouds looking through a portal of some kind. These are all things that we can observe in the natural world around us, but the way Paulina reframes them really elevates their existence and leads to some beautiful, memorable, and powerful paintings. So, to sum up part 1 of this study, here are 4 key characteristics to Pauline Voß's art. Number 1, Paulina's work often features very dark, magical, fantasy themes involving a lot of elements of drama and witchcraft. 2, the color palettes are usually cool toned, involving a lot of blues, purples, greens, and pinks, often with tiny little pops of warm accent tones to balance things out. 3, the lighting appears dramatic, not necessarily due to dark shadows alone, but also because of how the muted tones and low contrast between values seems to simulate nighttime. And number 4, magical elements like floating specks, holographic colors, and recontextualized elements of nature add the extra touch of witchiness to these portraits. For our study today, this is the beautiful reference that I've chosen. I know it doesn't follow the cool tone trend in most of Paulina's work, but I really loved this particular portrait and wanted to have a shot at it. Starting as always with a sketch, I first set about trying to get the big shapes down, as I always do with one-to-one studies. And let's talk about proportions here, since we didn't really talk about anatomy in part 1 today. While for the most part Paulina draws faces that seem to be fairly realistic at first glance, there are some significant stylistic choices that really add a lot of appeal to these characters. First, of course, there's the eyes. They're quite rounded, and although not super enlarged or placed super low on the head, they do take up a lot of the attention. I think this is primarily because they tend to be the area of highest contrast in the face, in that there is usually a lot of darkness around the lashes and eyelids, and these super bright specular highlights in the eyes themselves. Another interesting detail is that the irises are usually unnaturally colored, and sometimes almost look like they might blend right into the whites of the eyes. Plus, the specular highlights are almost always highly saturated pops of neon color, as opposed to just being a bright white. And often the pupils are quite light as well, causing the entire eye to look really glassy and reflective. The noses tend to be a little idealized, so small, narrow, and rounded at the tip, and the lips are often full and colored quite dark, but not overly pouty or glossy. I started off by putting some colors into the background just for a bit of context, then got to work shading her in. What I didn't anticipate was just how desaturated a lot of the colors were. At first glance, it all seemed so warm and orangey, but the more I painted, the more I realized that the colors were a lot cooler toned, almost verging on reds and salmon pinks. It was also a real challenge to try and nail the colors on either side of her nose, because I kept feeling like I was going too dark, when in fact I was simply going too warm. Well, hindsight is 2020, huh? Hands down, my favorite part to paint though was the eyes. Man, I love that look so much when the irises almost fuse right into the sclera and the specular lights are all these vibrant colors. That is definitely a look I'm going to play around and experiment with in my own art going forward. My least favorite bit was the hair, mostly because of all the abstraction. It is such a beautiful look, but you just know the hair is something Paulina built up in layers over time, and so the little details and nuances are the result of this gradual build-up of brushwork. But when you're trying to study that much detail off of a finished painting, oh, it's hard. The final step was all those magical overlays, and I actually figured that a quick way to do it might be to paste in a galaxy space type image and set the whole thing to color dodge instead of trying to paint all those details by hand and having it look too artificial, especially in the hair. And then after some color adjustment and some lovely little floating specks, here's the finished study. I really like how it turned out. What do you guys think? The original piece is one where I wanted to play around more with all those cool tones, coupled with the warm pops and glowy elements and such. The idea was to show a character coming out from under the shroud of darkness, finally allowing herself to explore what might be out there in the moonlight. Now, did I go too far with the 3 million compositional elements and details on her? Maybe. But the main focus for this pose was that sense of agency that we looked at in part 1, where Paulina paints her scenes in such a way that the character appears to be in charge of it all. So I definitely wanted her to be the one taking the cloak off. And I started by throwing some deep blues, purples, and muted aqua tones in the background before blocking her in with a dusty purple. I also wanted there to be a nice red glow popping out from inside her cloak, kind of like the glowy headdresses that we saw in Paulina's work in part 1. Of course, a lot of the colors changed over time, as did all of the jewelry, and I also turned the snake dark. And of course, the eyes had to be super light with those high saturated specular highlights. The longest part of the process was definitely rendering all that jewelry. I had a bit of time and thought to paint it all by hand rather than pasting in any PNGs or photo textures. One thing I should mention though is that a lot of the rendering is quite soft and blended out, and it all really started to match Paulina's style when I took a soft blender to the skin and stuck to rendering with a flat round brush rather than my usual textured square chalk brush. I found this star motif brush that was perfect to stamp all over the shroud and render it all in gold. Those are little pops of warm light, okay? But then at this point I paused painting and came back a little later and realized that there just wasn't enough balance in the painting. It all felt overly cool toned and therefore a little flat. So I did a quick hue adjustment, turned that vibrant red hair wrap into a slightly muted orange, and that is so much better. God, this has to honestly be my favorite painting I've ever done. The elements all came together so nicely, and I really love how magical and vibrant it all feels. Honestly, I might be in love. And there we have it, Pauline Voß demystified. I'm gonna be honest, you guys, this has to be my personal favorite style study that we have ever done. I know it's a bold statement, but her art it just does something to me. But what was your biggest takeaway from this study? Comment below and let me know. I have of course linked all of Paulina's work down in the description below, so make sure you go show her some love for me. And if you've enjoyed this video, show me some love as well by giving it a big thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. I've got a ton of art content on there already, and there's a ton more to come, I promise, so I'd love to have you along for the ride. Are there any other artists you'd like to see a style study on in the future? First, check out my style study playlist. I'll leave it here in the outro in just a sec. I've done a ton of these already, and chances are I've probably covered some of your faves on the series before, but if I haven't, feel free to leave me a comment below or come tell me on my Discord server, and I'll add your artists to my ever-growing list. Alrighty, you guys, that's about everything for this video, so thank you so much for hanging out with me. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Check out some more style studies down here, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!